I'm not coming to these academic conclusions because I hate D&D or because I hate World of Warcraft. I have a deep passion for those games, you know. I love those games. But that doesn't mean I don't get to critique them too.
Greetings all, D&Disability here. I have a special guest, one of my first and fellow academics here delving into RPG studies, game studies, not quite disability studies, but maybe we'll be able to get there. So, we'll see. But first things first, Mark Hines, can you tell me a bit about yourself? What do you normally study outside of RPGs, or is that really your main thing?
Uh, Howdy there, everybody. Yeah, I guess it's so interdisciplinary these days in academia. And what that means is that the walls between one subject area have kind of eroded. So I pitch myself usually as someone who studies fantasy games. More specifically, I study the representation of race and gender within fantasy games, usually role-playing games, because coming from an English background, they usually have the most narrative and character depth to them. But yeah, generally, I would say fantasy role-playing games are up my alley. That's what I like the most.
First things first, for the audience at home, I'm going to take a bit from your abstract here. So that said, let's actually get into what you say in your new March 2023 Becoming Halfling article. As much as I'd love everyone to read this, sadly, this is not an object that's open to the public, but hopefully, if this is of interest to you, maybe you can go and check it out. It's pretty awesome. It's up on doaj.org. So what do you actually say in your article Becoming Halfling? Well, to take directly from your abstract, live stream play of tabletop games affords a new medium for analysis of racialization for game studies. For Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition actual plays, audiences can engage with racialized narratives in underappreciated ways. The actual play, Critical Role, employs players' knowledge of the genre of high fantasy to create collaborative, improvisational narratives which delve into themes of racism and bigotry. This dynamic often leads players to draw on real-world political narratives and discourses in order to engage audiences' prior knowledge and examine pertinent themes. This paper analyzes one such example in the case of Not the Brave, a character in Critical Role's popular second campaign. Not's narrative arc, taking place over several hundred hours of gameplay, is a site of racialized play, problematizing simple narratives of representation and identity. This article employs textual analysis and semantics in examining Not's racialization as a goblin character. I draw heavily on Jerkin's 2004 notion of gameplay as narrative architecture in considering the limits that racialized play allows the cast of Critical Role. In doing so, I offer insights into how tabletop role-playing games' actual plays might add some nuance to debates surrounding narrative and gameplay in role-playing games, especially as it relates to narratives of white supremacy and domination. Now, there's a lot to unpack there,
Abstracts
obviously,
are
and
always quite the mouthful. Yeah, props to you.
there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure some people are going to look at what we just
Yeah,
put up there, and they're going to see fighting words. So
yeah, yeah.
before you eviscerate Mark here in the comments or me, I mean, by all means, go ahead, leave a comment, vent your spleen. It's fine.
Of
That's what the
course.
comment section's for. Can you discuss your overall thesis in becoming halfling? Chances are the audience won't be able to read it themselves anyway.
Yeah, I would be happy to say it. One thing, and let me mention this too, if there's any folks who are intrigued by this interview or by my work, I do think that through the journal, I still have some authorship permissions, which means that if you are so interested, and I can share my email with the folks out there, if you would like to read the full thing, it's probably something that I could send to you in PDF form, even though like you said, it is difficult sometimes for folks to access stuff online, but it may be something that I'm still legally permitted to share with you. So I would be happy to do that. The thesis, the main idea that I was trying to explore here is that even though race in Dungeons and Dragons and all of our favorite fantasy games is not the same as race as it exists in our current world, right? Even if we're thinking about race, Black folks, white folks, indigenous folks, whatever, as being a social construct, meaning that we created. It's not something that's totally biologically determined. It still shares some similarities with the way that we talk about it in fantasy. And that's what I'm looking at, the way that people talk about it, the way that it's perceived, the way that people use it. And so what I was trying to do in this article is to look at the ways that we talk about race in our world, the real world, and the ways that that overlaps with the way that they talk about race in fantasy worlds. In this case, the second campaign of Critical Role, around a character named Not the Brave, who is a goblin and is, well, transformed against her will into being a goblin. She's originally a halfling. We come to find out about a year into the campaign or so. So I'm looking at some of the ways that those discourses, those conversations about race, those ideas about the way that race actually works, and I use quotes for that, actual race or whatever, actually works, and the ways that those overlap with the way that race actually works in fantasy worlds. That's what I like to look at, is the way that race is similar and different to the way that we discuss race in our real world. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. One of my theories about race in D&D goes back to AD&D, where Gygax puts humans above all other species options, right? Saying that they are literally the best and everything else is demi-human. So
Mm-hmm.
my look at from the racial kind of perspective in D&D is from that perspective, the quite literal, there is a human supremacy, right? In kind of standard racial definition. So this is an interesting and different take on it. I like what I'm seeing here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example you bring up. That is kind of at the heart of the genre, which is a bit of a shame that Gygax was, for the most part, kind of a race essentialist, thinking that people could not trespass from one racial group to the other, or that races were very solidly defined into what they are. That's oftentimes a logic that we see in our fantasy worlds too. Even though in D&D Fifth Edition, when it was first released, at least, you get something like half elves and half orcs. For the most time, racial groups really stick together. They're impermeable is a word that I like to use a lot. They don't cross over between each other. There's very rigid walls between racial categories, and those walls are very well defined. They determine everything about who you are as a person is defined by your race, right? That's one of the more problematic aspects about race in fantasy that I try to look at, or I try to look at that as a reflection of the way that some people think that race exists in our world too.
Good distinction there. And before you tear us apart in the comments, I do know there are instances like the Mool in Dark Sun, the half dwarves, etc. But for the time being, we're going to table that discussion. And if we look at this in terms of original guidelines, humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, and those being the original four options, and that's it. I do think Mark's argument here holds water. But once again, feel free to disagree in the comments below. But Mark, what led you to your conclusions in becoming halfling? What got you to this thesis?
There's a couple of really interesting moments in the campaign that I look at that kind of just struck me as odd, I suppose. And that's where a lot of my own interest in this sprung from. I tell the story of when I first got interested in this. It was actually playing through oh gosh, what's the name of the module? I was playing through a module with some of my friends, a Dungeons and Dragons module, and we ended up killing some troglodytes in a cave. All because, we get there, we see the troglodytes, and my DM is immediately like, roll initiative. And I'm like, we don't even get to talk to them. They're living in their home, right? They're just doing their thing, and we're already fighting them. And I'm sure that's a very common experience for a lot of people when you encounter goblins or kobolds or orcs or anything like that, especially in older D&D. The way that race is just kind of used as a way to immediately create violence or tension or conflict in your setting, especially fantasy as a way of marking difference between people. That's those recurring patterns through a lot of the fantasy that I really enjoyed. And of course, like I'm not coming to these academic conclusions because I hate D&D or because I hate World of Warcraft. I have a deep passion for those games. I love those games. But that doesn't mean I don't get to critique them too, or the places where they fall short. But anyway, some of the observations that brought me to my thesis or this idea in becoming halfling, there's this moment when Not the Brave, who's played by Sam Riegel, she's this little goblin woman, right? And so she isn't allowed in a lot of cities. And it's the way that they frame that inherent criminality because she's a goblin, right? Like Sam often says, like, if not gets found in the city, if she gets found in this human area, they might kill her on sight. They might throw her in prison just for being a goblin. So oftentimes she has to wear a white mask or she has to wear white bandages. She literally has to pass in racial terms. She has to code or hide her racial identity so that she can go to a coffee shop, so that she can go to the library with her friends or something like that, right? And it's the way that when they're discussing that at the table, the way that it's very clear that they are drawing upon their own experiences with seeing race in our world. If, say, for example, they were aliens from outer space, the folks at Critical Role, and they had no idea of how race worked in our world, they wouldn't be creating those kinds of narratives. They have to come from somewhere. And the way that they use them is drawing upon their own ways of seeing race work in the real world. The way that race is sometimes seen as being an element of criminality in our world, or the way that race allows some people to move easy in some areas, and the way that race obstructs people from moving in other areas. That's what I was really trying to look at.
Excellent, excellent. And I thank you for those specific pieces of evidence because I often find in arguments kind of thrown out in and around the internet that we can give often general evidence, but rarely either attackers or detractors are willing to point to specific moments, which is one of the reasons why I take an academic approach and why I believe in bringing academia into the fold here, because getting too specifics can hopefully stop some of the misunderstanding, stop some of the hate, and bring us closer to a world of understanding where we can all continue to have fun.
Absolutely. And if I could, I just remembered
Go
the
ahead.
one example that I really, really like to talk about with this is they used to have an after talk show that they've scrubbed from the internet. Critical Role did because, well, the interviewer of the show turned out to be a rather unsavory person. Use the
Yeah,
internet, find that information out yourself, right?
yeah.
But they scrubbed a lot of those episodes. But there was an episode when Sam Riegel revealed that Knott was originally a halfling. They they asked about that tension that Sam's characters often have with goblins. And
Hmm.
Sam said that people often ask him, they're like, what, are you racist against goblins? Do you hate goblins? You know? And he says, of course I'm racist against goblins. And he's joking. He's joking, right? It's the moment's for a laugh.
Hmm.
But what interests me about that moment is the fact that we're even talking about it as being a question of racism. Does that make sense? Like it's like if race in D&D operated the way that if race in D&D operated in a way that was totally removed from the way that we talk about race in the real world, we wouldn't use the kind of language we do use to talk about it. There's a reason this is like the most touchy subject in all of fantasy, right? And it's because it's an enduring one that strikes at the heart of what a lot of the world building in this genre is about.
Well, and this is why we have movements going on currently, such as in my own home system and others, to either A, strip the word race out of it so we're delineating species versus culture, but also, and I think kind of more importantly, B, understanding and DMs, some DMs do this really well. Bill over at the Dungeon Delver. Hi, Bill. I'm sure you're going to hate me for this interview, but hi, Bill. What some do really well is to show the monsters being evil before you fight them, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
have this
Right.
kind of you have this contextualization of why do we hate these monsters, not only because they're monsters, but because they have tortured people or whatever. And in some
Sure.
instances, you don't find out until afterwards, or the monsters just attack you immediately, which is what the roll for initiative call that you might have said with your troglodyte example earlier would be an example of. So I don't know. That's one thought, but I do like where you're going with this. I personally find this quite fascinating.
Yeah, I suppose, and this goes back not just to Gygax, but also to Tolkien and even the stories that Tolkien was drawing upon when he was first writing Lord of the Rings, is that I suppose when it comes down to it, I dislike the way that when we talk about race in fantasy worlds, or even if it turns to species or culture, I just dislike the way that it often feels so essentialist, you know? Like if you're an orc, I know everything about you. I can stereotype you as an orc. I can say that I know these things about your culture, your morality, your intelligence, your background, your beliefs, and all of it. That's what I tend to dislike about the way that this trope is often used. And it's often when the trope is used in that way that I see the most racist and xenophobic reactions to it on the internet, right? One
Hmm.
of actually the pieces of scholarship that I draw upon in the work was someone doing the really tough work of going onto white nationalist forums and on Stormfront, right? And they were looking at their reactions to fantasy games, specifically Skyrim. And those folks read very much into the race aspects of Skyrim and of fantasy games, right? They see that stuff as being very reflective of what they think race is actually like. And that link troubles me a little bit. That's what I want to interrogate with my work is the way that race in some fantasy does an excellent job of exploring race in what I think is a really productive way, but sometimes it can feel a little stereotypical, I suppose. And that's a distinction that is really important.
And for those of us like myself that are fans of Tolkien, Tolkien does express this exact same tension in his letters, if you ever
Mm-hmm.
have the chance to read them. And of course, for the audience at home as well, he did not see orcs as absolutely evil or irredeemably evil, but he did have to acknowledge that the narrative was not from the orc's perspective, and that perspective matters. But RPGs are separate from, say, the perspective of the halflings in The Lord of the Rings because they're meant to present an omniscient view, an omnipotent view of the world. So, therefore, to essentialize in that sense is far worse than, say, for Frodo to do it, because you can understand that he might have just a limited perspective from the orc example, or Merry and Pippin as an example, who allegedly write the other half of the Lord of the Rings, really, if we
Mm-hmm.
consider the Book of Westmarch, etc., going back into Tolkien lore. But they might have a very strong distaste for orcs, but that's also because they were, kidnapped, beaten by them, etc., etc.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. It's a much different dynamic than if I were the DM to tell you, the players, as that omniscient, omnipotent being at the table, to say, no, all orcs worship Groom They are all evil. So you can kill them on sight, not have to think twice about it, right? It's much different than having that personal aspects like you highlight in Lord of the Rings. That's exactly right.
Good, good. Always, always beware of absolutes, right? This is
Yes,
something I tell
yes.
my students when I teach them. All of it. Always be aware of absolutes.
That's the case, certainly. Yeah. And
Good.
that's even the case for my work too, is people sometimes misconstrue this debate from an academic standpoint as being like, well, you must not like fantasy games, or you just hate all fantasy because of the way it pops up. But that's certainly not the case. I have dedicated so much of my adult life, too much of my adult life to this because I'm so drawn to these worlds and I love spending time with them. I just think that fantasy can and should be a little bit more mindful. And there's great examples of that stuff out there. I know many of you all have probably encountered really thoughtful fantasy that uses race as a metaphor in a way that shows that we can overcome our differences and our prejudices and our stereotyping, right? Like I'm a huge fan of Terry Pratchett, and Terry Pratchett does that all the time in such a delightful way.
What do you think your goals as an academic in RPG stroke fantasy studies are? I mean, you're obviously on the show, you're obviously speaking to kind of a broader audience, putting yourself out there. But what's the end goal here? What's the end game?
The end goal, I suppose, for me personally, is to try and land a job, which is quite difficult these days. But in the meantime, I am what's known in academic circles as ABD, which means all I'm having to do at this point is write my dissertation. In my dissertation, want to take a look at a lot of the changes to race in fantasy world since the Black Lives Matter protests and since comments like from Wizards of the Coast, where they admitted their long history of stereotypical racial depictions for the Drow or Orcs or the Vistani from Curse of Strahd. And I want to look at what they actually did after that, whether it's the changes they implemented in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, or something like Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, which brought in like a multicultural cast of writers. I want to look at audience reception to those in particular, as well as marketing materials.
That's awesome. I, for one, focused on disability in the sense that what do these games do for players with disabilities? How do we create
Right?
disabled communities? right? And I would love to go back for a PhD and pursue that. So I am envious of you there.
Do so very, make the right choice for you, of course. It can be tough out here. It can be very, very tough in the PhD realm these days, just in terms of money and job security going forward. But I'll also say that the opportunity to study stuff that I passionately care about, for however many thousands of years of recorded human history, I wouldn't be able to do that. I'd be, working in a field or working in a smithy or being sent off to some war. And it does feel very privileged and cool to dedicate, one's at least a portion of one's adult life to studying, super nerdy cultural artifacts. That's the fun of it. And it is fun sometimes.
As a dedicated medievalist, well, that's what my bachelor's was in.
Mhm.
I for one can definitely attest to that, right? I also kind of attest to that the pre-modern constructions of race seem to be genuinely different than what we see in, say, the turn of the 18th century,
Right.
really onwards, especially with the development of scientific racism. So
Mm.
that also, I think, could be an interesting topic to look at because I haven't really found a satisfactory examination in that sense. But also, to be fair, in the medieval world, that it mattered a lot less. Your religion mattered a lot more, and your overall economic status mattered a lot more than, say, the fact that you are a Saxon or that you are a Dane or that you are a Norman. It just marked you as not being an Angle or not being a Jew
Right.
or not being a Gaul, right? And or Frank and those and that came with its own prejudices, but it was very different from how we kind of see it today.
Yeah, as someone who's only tangentially a medievalist, in the sense that what I study is so often appropriating, what the medieval was really like, my impression is that religion was much more significantly an indicator of, someone's worldview and stereotypes or prejudices that one might have about them, whether someone was a Christian or whether someone was a Moor or whether someone was, Jewish. That was far more important than what we think of as being race was currently in the modern era, right?
And sometimes and what makes this kind of really hard to delineate is sometimes these things blend together, right?
Yeah,
Being a
very much so.
goblin isn't just a species thing. In some ways, DMs are like, well, all goblins have this culture, all goblins do this, and we can see kind of the same stereotypes in the medieval world with, say, Jewish communities as well. And I've seen those arguments mapped.
Your entire goal and mission of taking what so many academics do and breaking it down for a popular audience is so, for me, integral to like what we should be doing. There is no, in my opinion, white ivory tower that we all need to be hiding in. That
You can't
seems
afford
rather
it.
silly. Yeah, no, we can't afford it anymore. It doesn't seem the proper response to the political moments that universities are in either, in my opinion.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, I won't hold you too long here, but are there any final comments, any final thoughts that you would like to share? I know we couldn't possibly talk about everything you're interested in. You're more than welcome to come back on the show, but is there anything you'd like to leave us with before you go?
Oh goodness. Well, as I mentioned perhaps at the top of the interview, if you were at least intrigued by our little conversation about it here, please feel free to reach out to me via email. I can share my personal non-academic email, which tends to filter out people sometimes. I can share that email with you if you'd like, and
I
then
can throw it in
perhaps
the comment section down below.
yeah, that would be excellent. So if folks want to read the full piece, perhaps I can disclose it. But if I leave folks with anything, perhaps it's something we were talking about before we started recording, which is to try out other systems, right? Try out other frameworks. I know people are repeating it incredibly these days, especially since the OGL debacle with Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro. But give other games a shot. There's so much out there. There's an incredible amount of games out there, and even though I focus on D&D because it's still the kingpin after all these years. There's still so much out there that deserves a lot of play and attention. So that's what I'll leave us with, is hopefully something a little bit more bright, positive, and cheery. And this is, of course, let me leave us with something else.
Hmm.
I'm not the kind of academic who thinks that, well, if you play orcs this way or goblins that way, I don't think it makes you a bad person. I don't think it makes you racist. I'm trying to study the links that are there between the way that we have built up this genre and the way that it is still touching and impacting our understanding of race in the world. The way that those combine and than dissimulate is very interesting to me. There is no moral judgment here, unless, of course, all you play is D&D. Then there is a moral judgment. You should try and play something else too.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mark Hines, for being here. And remember, if you want to see some of his work, comment on it, really kind of spread the word about it, feel free, send him an email. Us academics, we need support. Buy him a cup of coffee, whatever. His information will be down in the description. As always, you can catch me over on Bill's show on Tuesday nights. You can catch me over occasionally on Paint Minis Live if he needs a game run or something else. And like always, remember to like, share, subscribe, and I will see you next week with more RPG content. Thanks, guys.
Bye, all.